Hello and welcome to Voice of Russia debate. I am Nikolai Goshkov and I will be discussing the outcome of the NATO summit in Wales. Its blueprint for tomorrow, as its outgoing Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said at the news conference. Well, it was originally expected to be a dull, mundane affair of discussing lessons learned from Afghanistan and some brainstorming maybe in the search for new raison d'etre after what looked like the end of an era of military incursions into Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. The almost moribund NATO, in the words of quite a few commentators, was facing yet another challenge of reinventing itself. Not anymore, though. One might suggest that if there was no Ukraine crisis, it should have been invented. Or was it? Some tough words were spoken at the summit and some tough action is pending. So where to now for NATO, Russia and Ukraine? To discuss this, I am joined in the Voice of Russia London studio by Sunny Handel, journalist, political commentator, editor of the political blog Liberal Conspiracy, Dr. Ian Kearns, co-founder and director of the European Leadership Network, Chris Nynam, co-founder and vice chair of Stop the War Coalition, and on the line from Moscow, a political analyst with Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich. Welcome to the debate, gentlemen. The NATO summit's agenda and its running order were changed several times over in reaction to events on the ground, mostly in Ukraine and Iraq. Is NATO trying to firefight here rather than painstakingly work to create an all-inclusive system of collective security from the Atlantic to the Pacific, as Russia has been suggesting for a long time? Chris Snyder.
Well, I think in a certain sense both. I think the crises that we're seeing in Iraq and in Ukraine are the product of decades of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. We've seen, I think, 12 new Eastern European countries accede to NATO since 1991. And I think that's the background to the situation in Ukraine. Clearly, the background to what's happened in Iraq is the occupation, primarily, fundamentally, the invasion and occupation of 2003 onwards. So the more aggressive foreign policies that have been pursued by NATO and its leading member countries particularly have created the crises. But now you very much have the feeling that the leadership doesn't know how to deal with them. It doesn't have any solutions apart from almost reluctantly more of the same. We're talking about growing pressure to escalate the bombing in Iraq and increased sanctions against Russia, but a kind of gradual drawing in of more forces into the theatre in Eastern Europe. So you kind of feel they don't really know how to respond to the mayhem that their policies over the last 2 or 3 decades have caused.
Well, we heard, of course, a lot during the summit and before it that, thank goodness, NATO has expanded before the current crisis, because at least now a lot of countries feel more safe than they otherwise would have been had NATO not expanded. But this is, especially in the face of Russia's perceived belligerence, isn't this really a question of chicken and egg? Whether NATO expansion is a result of Russia's perceived belligerence, or is Russia's perceived belligerence a result of a relentless NATO expansion? Dr. Kearns.
Well, I think that's a good question, because there were many analysts in the West, including very influential ones like George Kennan, who opposed the enlargement of NATO into Eastern Europe. And that wing of the debate wasn't able to win the argument, and NATO enlarged. You're right that if you go to many capitals in Eastern Europe, that their strong perception there is that they wanted to be inside NATO because they feared Russia. They feared what kind of actor Russia would become when the Soviet Union broke up. And they now, many of them, view what's happened as a justification of their original fears and are very pleased that they're inside NATO because they think it provides them with some kind of protection. And I think although one can be very critical of many things that Western leaders have done, I personally was very critical of the intervention in Iraq. Although one can be very critical of that, it's a gross overstatement to say that what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Iraq are just a product of NATO policy. I mean, there are lots of other actors here which have to take a substantial portion of the responsibility. And right now, I think inside Ukraine, President Putin has to take a lot of responsibility for what's going on. I think many analysts in Russia and President Putin and his advisors themselves have made a mistake with Ukraine. They feared that Ukraine would become part of NATO. And I think the reason why this is a mistake is that there is just no consensus inside NATO to offer membership to Ukraine or to Georgia for that matter. I've noted people already commenting today that Rasmussen's talked about some support for Georgia. The key decision that was taken by NATO in terms of enlargement this year was 2 months ago, And it basically made clear to the Georgians and to everybody else that nobody else was getting in from the Caucasus, Ukraine, or anybody else. And there's absolutely no chance of Ukraine being offered NATO membership, or Georgia being offered NATO membership for the next decade at least, and probably 2 decades.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, let's actually go to a Russian analyst here. Is not Russian reaction an overreaction, really?
Well, first I would like to disagree what Ian Kearns just said. With all due respect, I didn't conclude from the statements from Mr. Rasmussen that NATO membership is not in view for Ukraine for such a long period. He basically just recently visited Kiev, and he said that if Ukraine gives up the legislation which makes it a non-bloc country, according to a certain Ukrainian law, Ukraine cannot be a member of a military bloc. So if Ukraine lifts that legislation, it can join NATO. And now that Ukraine, I will be calling a spade, now that Ukraine is no longer a democracy, that there is just one group of parties and one ideology ruling the country, unopposed, unlike it was during the last 23 years, it will be very easy to lift this law, because now the south and the east of the country are not represented in the new parliament. They will not be represented starting from October, and right now the parliament is completely, under the influence of the prime minister, the president, and the group that holds power. So it will be very easy to join NATO under such circumstances. For Georgia, it's the same situation. Mr. Rasmussen at the NATO summit has just said that they are preparing a package of documents. Today I watched an interview on BBC with Georgi Margvelashvili, the Georgian president. He said that his country was going to join NATO. It was in the works. And I perceive what's going on very tragically. I think what we see now is the whole security system in Europe crumbling. Europe facing much graver danger of war than at any time since the end of the Second World War, probably since the early 50s. And I also would like to say that with Syria and Iraq, I tend to agree with Chris Nineham, because, but this Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, just recently it was battling President Assad. And obviously it profited from lots of aid that was provided to the anti-Assad opposition by the United States, by the European Union, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar. At the time, we heard that there were no terrorists fighting against Mr. Assad, that it was just the Syrian media that called these people terrorists. This is a very usual quote that you heard from the Western media, that it's just the Syrian media who calls these people terrorists.
This begs a question. What is the biggest threat to NATO countries' security right now? Some people would actually say that probably it's the homegrown jihadis who are returning or about to return, battle-hardened in Syria and Iraq, or about to return. I was about actually to ask Sonny Hundel.
But I can tell you very briefly, I think the greatest danger to NATO is NATO itself, its own aggressive and unpredictable actions. The crisis in NATO, the crisis in Ukraine was created by NATO and by the European Union when they put Ukraine before a choice it hated to make. Before a choice, it's either the European Union or Russia. Ukraine is a country with two heads. If you push towards the west too much, the east falls off. If you push towards the east too much, the west falls off. This is the reason why President Kuchma and then later President Yanukovych and even President Yushchenko, why they never said 100% yes or no to Russia or to the European Union, because the moment they say it, they would have been ruling just 50% of their country. So what happened was a direct consequence of NATO's actions. What happened in Iraq is a direct consequence of NATO's actions, because they supported the anti-Assad rebellion in Syria, and when this rebellion got out of control and started to create a Sunni caliphate, that was the consequence of the Western involvement in the Syrian civil war.
We'll return to this issue later, but Sonny Hundel, is it not true that probably the biggest threat might come from within, and it's not the external aggressor, whom NATO should be, preparing to deal with, but rather internal,
internal incompetence?
Well, I doubt it. I mean, just to give you some figures, over 1,000 people have now been killed in the conflict, mostly Eastern Ukrainians in Europe over the last few months since Russian aggression into eastern Ukraine. and over 1 million people have been displaced from that area. Now, the point here is that it wasn't that the Ukrainian government was put into a sort of a bind by NATO. The problem is that Russia invaded Ukraine, and that was directly because of the fact that the Ukrainians themselves, if we remember, and everyone seems to have conveniently forgotten this, that the Ukrainians themselves rose up against the government last year, against their policies, and said they wanted to be closer to the EU. Now, I find it astonishing that people from, for example, Stop the War and others have completely ignored the fact that Russia invaded Crimea and annexed it, which was illegal under international law because it wasn't their territory. There's no getting away from that fact. So you cannot say NATO is responsible for imperialism and completely ignore the fact that Russia invaded another country, annexed their territory. I mean, and also the other point about Iraq is also ridiculous. The Syrian coalition and the opposition to Assad has changed over time. And obviously, the Islamic State has become much more of a threat, and it's become a problem. But the Islamic State themselves attacked, defeated, and killed a lot of the secular opposition, which initially what the US government was supporting. So those people have died. It's not the Islamic State that the USA was funding. On the other hand, the Russian government did fund and is still funding Assad, a guy who has now killed over 200,000 Muslims in that area. No one seems to have been condemning that fact. This guy has killed 200,000 people. So, if you're going to blame someone for aggression, then you have to blame Assad, and you have to ask who's funding that. If you want to blame someone for aggression in Ukraine, you have to ask why are 1 million people displaced and why 1,000 people in that area have lost their lives. And those people have not lost their lives because of NATO. They have lost their lives because troops came in from Russia and because they have started sort of fighting with militias, people from eastern Ukraine. I mean, this bizarre redrawing of history is funny, but it's just not the truth.
Sunny, I'm afraid it's a little bit more complicated than that because
Can I say a few words in response?
Yeah. Just a second.
We all want to do
yes,
that.
I think the sequence of events, it's a long one, but it started with some violent clashes in Kiev. And Dmitry, like you said, Ukraine is not a homogeneous country, and people in the east of the country were really taken aback and afraid by what they saw happening in Kiev. They didn't want this to happen in
but they
their
didn't
parts
ask
of
for
the
Russia
world.
to invade.
Yeah,
Yes,
let me just
Kearns.
make a couple of points. I mean, first of all, let me unusually perhaps agree with some things that Dima Babic had to say. I agree with him about the gravity of the situation. I don't think this is a little local difficulty in Ukraine. I think we're on the verge of something potentially very serious indeed in terms of confrontation between Russia and the West, which could turn military, either intentionally or unintentionally. There are a number of moving parts here which could lead to unintentional escalation. I also agree, and I've said on Voice of Russia programs before, that the European Union, as opposed to NATO, made a fundamental mistake in some of its rhetoric with regard to Ukraine. Some Western leaders were talking about a civilizational choice for Ukraine, and I think it was a fundamental mistake, because Dima is right that Ukraine is a divided country, although it's not as divided as many in Russia like to portray, but it is a divided country, not only in terms of sentiment and politics and nationality, but also economically. It needs to face both ways. And if Ukraine is to have a future, a reasonable future with a reasonable economy, it has to do productive economic relations with Russia and with the West. And so some practical way of establishing that needs to be found. But again, not surprisingly, let me disagree with one other very important point that Dima made. I mean, this is, I think, a mistake that Russian analysts and policymakers make time and time again. They mistake what is essentially a Western deceit, a deceit carried out with regard to its own publics, as some kind of geopolitical power play on the part of NATO. Let me explain what I mean. Western leaders like to sound tough. They want to talk about the fact that nobody is allowed to determine who becomes a member of NATO. And so all the stuff you're hearing from Rasmussen today, coming out of the summit, is all aimed at saying to the West's own publics, nobody gets to push us around. Russia doesn't, and it's aimed at the eastern members of NATO as well, basically saying Moscow doesn't have a veto on who's a member of our alliance. Okay, now, in Moscow, that's often portrayed as this enlargement is going to happen. But the reality is, and this is why I say it's a Western deceit, The reality is that Rasmussen can say what he likes. He can't deliver the 28 members of NATO behind the decision to enlarge to Georgia, and he can't deliver the members of NATO to enlarge to Ukraine. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a very good concrete reason. With regard to Georgia, for example, the real reason why Georgia is not getting into NATO, unless there's a fundamental transformation in the relationship between Georgia and Russia in a positive direction, is because everybody in Brussels knows that 5 minutes after Georgia gets in, the Georgians are going to turn up at NATO headquarters and invoke Article 5 telling us the Russians have just done something. And the issue for NATO is not who wants to be in. We can't and we will not, as members of NATO, say to other countries, do not aspire to membership. We will not say that to the Georgians or the Ukrainians. But we, in the end, as member countries of NATO, have to ask a different question, which is, do we intend and can we deliver a defence of the members of NATO? And if we don't intend to go to war with Russia over Georgia, or intend to go to war with Russia over eastern Ukraine, and we don't intend to do either, let's be absolutely clear about that. That's a fundamental perception in most of the key capitals of Europe. Then enlargement will not be extended to those countries. And Rasmussen, who's an outgoing Secretary General, can say what he likes. He doesn't, and this is one thing that people need to understand about NATO. The Secretary General doesn't call the shots. He operates in a political environment in which the heads of state from the national capitals call the shots. And that's a fundamental point to keep in mind.
I'll come to you, Christina, in a second. I'll just, Dmitry,
yes.
Is it a red herring? Is NATO's perceived threat a red herring, really?
Well, certainly it's not a red herring. And I appreciate what Ian Kearns has just said. I would like to believe it. I would like to believe that NATO's Secretary General is not the same thing as Secretary General of the CPSU, you know, that his words are not going to have the same weight. But I'm very skeptical because we have seen how all 28 NATO member states aligned behind what Seni Handel described as Ukrainian people raising against the dictator. And basically, I think these words are, untrue, because Yanukovych, bad as he might be, was legally elected in 2010. That election was recognized by the West. So it was quite clear that the West was very partial in that confrontation, which was very bloody in Kiev. There were several dozen people killed. And it was very interesting that when there were rumors that Yanukovych might be using live bullets, the whole NATO said that he would be under sanctions, he would be arrested if he goes abroad. And now that the new Ukrainian regime is using aviation, tanks, artillery, whatever you want, in the east of Ukraine, there is not a single word of reproach. All 28
because they're
NATO
trying to protect
states,
their own territory. That's why. I mean,
yes,
are you saying that?
I'm going to finish because I was not interrupting you. And when you said, for example, that no one has condemned the fact that Russia finances Assad, this is simply not true, because this was condemned at G8 summits.
So you agree that Russia? So you agree that Russia was financing Assad? You agree that, right?
No, I don't agree. But I think that Russia provided some moral support to Assad, and before the civil war in Syria, Russia helped Syria to build its army. I think if Assad had crumbled last year when the intervention by the Western powers was very near, IS, Islamic State, would be now in Baghdad, because Islamic State in Syria and Iraq is the strongest armed group in the area. It would have thrown out this useless coalition, so-called liberal coalition, in a second. It would have taken the chemical weapons and other weapons from the Syrian regime, and the caliphate would
Islamic State wasn't even the caliphate wasn't even in existence a year ago. The caliphate was not even in existence a year ago.
Jabhat al-Nusra and other militant Sunni organizations were there, and they included the same people with the same ideology as the Islamic State. They were there from the very beginning of the Syrian revolution. Sorry, Seni Handel, but you are misbehaving. You have been telling lies here for 10 minutes and I didn't interrupt you, and now you don't let me say a word. What you said about Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a blatant lie, because I was there, I was reporting from there. The two English reporters who reported that the Russian column entered Ukraine, I worked with them in the Russia Profile magazine. They are pathological liars.
Okay, well, I don't have a problem.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're being carried away. Basically,
so I
we're
will
discussing.
Just finish very quickly about what Seni Handel said, because it's important. There are are 2,000, not 1,000 people killed in eastern Ukraine, and most of the 1 million refugees that Seni Handel talked about went to Russia, at least 700,000 of them. So it's a very strange situation when people go to the alleged aggressor instead of taking refuge inside their own country, which shows you the situation is a lot more complicated than Seni Handel wants us to believe.
I didn't say it
Dmitry, you hijacked my question. I was about to ask why the bulk of refugees went to Russia, but let's give a word to Chris Neidham, because he's been waiting for a long time to get in.
I admire his patience.
Just a couple of points, really. The first is that, I mean, I think you have to put yourself in the minds of people in Russia, and I must admit that Ian's kind of words of reassurance just seem to me to be completely unlikely to have any impact for a whole number of reasons. First, I mean, the West, including senior US officials, said back in the early 90s that the states previously in Soviet area of influence wouldn't be asked or wouldn't be allowed to join NATO. So these kind of assurances have no historical basis.
Again, that's not true.
And
That's not true.
it is true. But anyway,
You're rewriting history.
but what's happening? No, I'm not rewriting history. I'm talking about what's actually happened. But the reality on the ground is, since the 90s, a whole number of Eastern Europe countries have actually joined NATO. So it's not about rhetoric coming from NATO. It's about the physical reality. If you look at a map, what you have seen. Sorry.
So what?
Are you going to let me speak, Sonny, or not?
No, but let's have a discussion. This is a discussion, right? I mean, everyone can have a half an hour.
You're just interrupting me. Well, don't. I want to finish.
I thought we were having a discussion here. This is a discussion.
This is a serious situation.
Sure. No one's denying that this is a serious situation, but we're having a discussion here.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be a shouting match, because otherwise our listeners would...
No, but you're interrupting me and you're not letting me speak.
When we're all talking all together.
I think we should all agree not to interrupt each other.
Exactly. So this isn't about rhetoric from NATO. This is about reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that Western power has been extended towards the borders of Russia systematically over the last 25 years. And anyone who thinks that that doesn't create a context which is going to threaten Russia is living in cloud cuckoo land, to be honest. And then, on top of that, you have to look at what's actually happened in the last months. And you have seen a government that was essentially a pro-Russian government that has been destabilised partly by protests internally, but has also been replaced by a government that was, as we know from leaked phone calls, was partly hand-picked by US diplomats whose discussions about who exactly should be in and out of the Ukrainian government were broadcast, so no one can deny that's a fact. On top of that, you have a massive increased amount of Western military presence in the region, including this summer scheduled war games being conducted by Britain, by US, by other NATO countries, actually in Ukraine. This was what was scheduled. So, I mean, the idea that that isn't going to create a crisis inside Russia, the idea that isn't going to create a situation of massive tension is just absurd, leaving aside the impact that it had on internal politics within Ukraine. That's point one. Point two, more briefly, is Sunni didn't mention the fact in his discussion about the causes of the current crisis in Iraq that since 2003 there was an invasion by NATO countries, by the leadership of NATO, which actually led to the death of, as we know, probably about 500,000 people, but more importantly, led to the destruction of civil society, the breakup of the infrastructure, led directly to, for the first time really in Iraqi history, massive tensions on the ground between Sunni and Shia, and a huge increase of sectarianism. Now, not to even mention that in your discussion of the situation now shows a complete lack of any serious analysis. I mean, whether or not you see it
as opposed to the Iran-Iraq war between two countries, which was all about sectarian violence.
Did we just agree not to interrupt each other?
I mean, come on. You're rewriting history and you expect no one to contradict you. That's ridiculous.
I expect no one to interrupt me, please.
Okay, you've had about half an hour to talk. Can someone else step in?
No, I'm going to finish my point.
If you could finish it briefly, because I'm
come on.
Okay, what I'm saying is that you can't discount the impact. I'm not saying it's the only factor. Clearly, that would be absurd. But the idea that we can discount the whole history of the recent occupation of Iraq by the Western powers in understanding how that country is fragmented and fallen apart is completely ridiculous. It has to be seen as a central element in any discussion, and therefore the idea of repeating the same, doing more of the same, bombing Iraq again, is an absurdity.
Let's just make it
Come on, I've been patient for quite a while.
These are really brief points.
Sure, go on.
Just factually, let's get a few things straight. NATO didn't do anything in Iraq. Individual countries did. NATO did nothing. And this is a discussion about the NATO summit. And NATO is not doing anything now in relation to Iraq. The Americans are the only power carrying out airstrikes. There's no other NATO power that's yet taken that decision. There's no other NATO power that's taken that decision to do so. And there may be one or two out of the 28, but the rest will not. Secondly, it's just factually incorrect to say that the West promised that there'd be no NATO enlargement. That's just not true. What the Western powers promised would be that there'd be no permanent stationing of NATO forces in the eastern part of Europe, and that was a commitment made at the time. It's a commitment that will be has been honoured at least up to this point, but no promises were made about membership. Some difficult things happened in Kiev. I think there's some very important history to be written about what happened with the fall of the Yanukovych regime. I think we're all speculating about what really happened during that period. Yes, there were unfortunate statements made by American leaders that gave the impression that they were trying to engineer an outcome in Kiev, and maybe they were. But all of that said, I come back to the very first point I made. Other people have got responsibility here as well. And it may well be right that the American leadership were trying to engineer who would govern Ukraine. In Moscow, a decision was still taken to invade another territorially independent and sovereign state. Yes. And an invasion did take place in Crimea. And I'm sorry, Dima, your experience, I'm sure you report faithfully and sincerely. But I am telling you now, it is a factual truth. Russian military units and armoured columns are in eastern Ukraine. I've seen the proof myself in Luhansk in the last few days. There are Russian armoured columns there. And Russian military units are not just there handing over weapons to eastern rebels. They are fighting as integrated units. And that's precisely why the conditions on the battlefield have changed in recent days. And that's precisely why the peace deal that President Putin sketched out on a napkin on his way over to Mongolia the other day is being taken seriously by the leadership in Ukraine, which knows it's now fighting against the Russian army and not a bunch of ragtag rebels, and it knows it can't win and it's not going to get any support from the West.
Yeah, well, we may debate whether there are Russian troops or not.
No, come on. It's my chance now.
Dmitry, first to Sunny, please.
Okay,
I heard you and I understand where you're coming from, but do you think there is a military solution to this at all?
I think yes. I mean, look, no, there is no military solution to this. I don't think that we should get into war. I think that Russia should pull back its troops, not just from eastern Ukraine, but also from Crimea. It is not a territory that it owns legally. And so Ian pointed out quite clearly, and I think it's astonishing that people who claim to be, stopping the war against war have completely, ignored the fact that Russia invaded another sovereign nation and have focused on Iraq and the bombardment of Iraq, which I opposed myself in 2003, but now have completely given a blank check to what, said nothing about what Russia did in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. So now put that aside for a second. Let's talk about where we are. Everyone has their own views about what happened on the ground and who's responsible. And that can be debated endlessly. What NATO should have done ages ago, it should have stationed NATO troops in eastern Ukraine to guarantee Ukrainian sovereignty a while back. Then Russia would have had no excuse or would not have had a chance to invade and keep their troops on the ground. And that's what NATO is now going towards. And so we're basically now in a situation where they should have been months ago, so we could have avoided all this displacement. We could have avoided all the people who have died. We could have even avoided the disaster of the MH17 flight that went down because of weapons that reportedly came from Russia. So now all these people have died. And to what extent, so the point is NATO not only has to, well, for a start, NATO has to guarantee, and President Obama did do that. He said this week, last week he went there and he said NATO will guarantee the sovereignty of all its members, which was an important statement to make. And that means that NATO has to guarantee the sovereignty of the Baltic states.
Sunny, but Ukraine is not a NATO member.
I agree. Ukraine is not a NATO member, and I don't think that will change anytime soon. But I do think that NATO has to stand up for sovereignty. And I agree that there is a lot of sort of hypocrisy in the way that, for example, they invaded Iraq and they have now, said all this stuff to Russia for invading Ukraine. But that does not mean that other people are also allowed to be hypocritical. I mean, I remember just a few years ago when Prime Minister Vladimir Putin wrote about people invading other countries, wrote a piece in the New York Times, and now he's completely ignored that when he invaded Ukraine. So the situation of where we are is that NATO has to offer support to other countries in the Baltic regions and in countries like Poland, which are part of the coalition. And if Russia invades and keeps its troops and permanently destabilizes Ukraine, badly destabilizes Ukraine, then other states in those areas will get more worried that Russia is going to go after them next. And NATO has to guarantee their sovereignty. So it has to put troops there anyway, because that is the reality of where we are now. So unless Russia pulls back its troops and Russia guarantees the sovereignty of Ukraine and stabilizes that region for a second, we are only going to get into more escalation, and we're only getting closer to war here. So the first step has to be taken by Russia. Russia cannot say, sorry, NATO is not allowed to have troops here, so we will carry on doing what we want to do. No, because those countries which are NATO countries in those areas are going to be worried about what Russia is doing and is going to say NATO has to guarantee our security because it's their right to do that. And so they will say, please, NATO, can you put some troops in? That's exactly what's happened. So the first step has to be taken by Russia. It cannot keep its troops in the tens of thousands in eastern Ukraine while claiming that they pose no threat, while claiming that there is no threat to anyone else. There are tens of thousands of troops. There are pictures taken of these people. There are convoys of people coming in.
Sunny, we can be debating the numbers
sure, fine. We can debate the numbers. That's fine. We can debate the numbers. I don't have a problem with that. And Dmitry himself can accuse anyone of lies. And, there's all sorts of stuff going on. But the fact of the matter is that NATO is not going to withdraw its troops from that region while the sovereignty of other NATO members in that region feels threatened. And they do feel threatened by Russian aggression because they've been invaded by Russia in the past. So they will say that. And the first step to de-escalation has to be taken by Russia.
Dmitry, do you believe that Russia may be harboring any ill intentions towards member states of NATO because of Article 5, if anything else?
No, I don't think so. But before answering, can I just ask a couple of quick questions to Ian Kearns? Well, Ian, you just said that NATO was not involved in the invasion of Iraq. Do you agree that NATO was involved in the regime change in Libya?
Yes, of course, NATO was involved in military action in Libya.
Okay, fine. That's what I wanted to hear. Now, do you agree? I will be very quick.
Your point being what, Dima? Yeah, I'm asking you what the point you think you've established.
I said quick question, quick answer. The second question is, do you agree with Senator McCain, who just said in an interview to CBS that Libya is a failed state paralyzed by a civil war now?
I think that Libya is a complete basket case, and I don't think Western intervention there produced anything like the result that people in the West thought it would produce. However, for what it's worth, I think for what it's worth, I think Western intervention did stop a pretty awful slaughter in Benghazi. And one of the things that people who, in the world who go around, blaming everything on the West always amaze me by is they must think that this is a Garden of Eden if only the West would stop screwing it up. I mean, seriously, there have been occasions when Western power has been used. It doesn't always produce the effects that people like. Often, the reason for its use is not some kind of geopolitical motivation, but an attempt to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. I think that was the motivation in Libya. I think the ultimate outcome has been bad.
Yes, very, very good motivation, yes. So, unfortunately,
what was the Russian motivation in Chechnya when Russian troops used all of the same tanks, air power and artillery that you're saying the Ukrainians using in Ukraine?
It's just amazing how liberal people are very intolerant, not only of other people's views, but also even of other people's questions.
I don't think I can be accused of intolerance of you, Dima.
My question was so short, just 10 seconds, and your answer was so long. That just brings me to the question that Nikolai has just asked. No, I don't think that Russia harbors any aggressive intent towards any NATO members. The case in Ukraine and in eastern Ukraine in particular is very, very special. And to compare it with the American invasion of Iraq is, I think is just absurd, because I think anyone with distant knowledge of geography knows that there is more similarity between Russians and people people who live in the east of Ukraine than between Americans and the British and the people who live in Iraq.
Dima, can I ask you a short question? Just a short question.
It's impossible to speak.
No, but just a very short question. Just a very short question.
Okay, ask me your short question.
Does that justify what Russia did? The fact that it's nearer to the Russian border and that some Russians live there? Is that the justification for a Russian invasion?
I was on the border. No, I think everything that Russia is doing in Ukraine is justified because I was at the border just recently. I saw the refugees who were cursing Mr. Poroshenko, who were cursing the new regime in Kiev. Until the new regime came, thanks to the so-called revolution imposed on Ukraine by the West, Ukraine had internal divisions, but it lived peacefully. It was only after this revolution, which, like many revolutions, was a bloody one, that Ukraine was plunged into a civil war. And I think this is very important here, that there is this difference of perceptions.
It was a short question, Dima. Thanks for the long answer.
Okay, Russia thinks that what's going on in Ukraine is a civil war. The Western media keeps saying that this is a Russian invasion. And this is simply not true, because if indeed Russia had tens of thousands of troops in eastern Ukraine, as Sunny is saying, then there would be not 10 people taken prisoner by the Ukrainian forces, but there would be hundreds of prisoners and hundreds of defectors. The war in Georgia, which was much shorter and much less cruel, there were about 10 Russian defectors who spoke to television in Tbilisi. This was not the case in Ukraine, and this makes all of these claims about Russian involvement very, very, very doubtful. Talking about what Sunny just said, that NATO should station its troops in Ukraine and should have stationed them in eastern Ukraine, I think it's a very good justification for what Putin did in Crimea, because the main motivation behind Russia's decision to take Crimea was that if Russia hadn't done it, there would have been NATO bases there in a year, maybe in 2 years. With the new regime in Kiev, this is more than possible. I agree with Ian that we live through a very, very dangerous period in the history of mankind, because the ability to listen to each other has never been smaller. The amount of unchecked information and direct lies in the media has never been greater. And I think we should all stop and think before we make another step. I think that basic reality on the ground is that Russia is not an aggressive state. Russia has not tried to invade NATO countries when it had a possibility to do it since the end of the Second World War. Russia peacefully gave up its influence in Central and Eastern Europe, and instead of gratitude, it got more and more strangling from the West. It got unfriendly actions in Georgia, in Ukraine, the creation of a whole belt of hostile countries around Russia. The Russian elite is still very intent on cooperation with the West. The West would commit a terrible mistake if it continues to alienate the Russian elite by imposing sanctions. And these sanctions are not going to end the civil war in Ukraine, because it's a civil war in Ukraine, not in Russia. You can impose tens of sanctions on Russia. This will not end the war in another country.
What next for NATO and Russia and Ukraine? Chris Neal.
Yeah, I think we're moving on to useful territory here, because I think the important thing is not to spend a lot of time talking about the causes and getting involved in a blame game here, because the situation is so frightening. In both of the theatres that we've been discussing, it seems to me that both sides, and we're here in the West, we have to concentrate very, very hard on everything we can do that will de-escalate tension, that will allow the possibility of political solutions and political discussions that can avoid not just the wars as they are, but avoid them spreading out of control into the regions. And it seems to me that increasing sanctions against Russia at this particular point is a bad thing to do, because it can only escalate. I think more war games in Ukraine or on the borders of Ukraine, again, for the same reasons, are a bad thing. And I think the idea of stepping up bombing on ISIS is basically precisely what they want, and so also a bad idea. I think we need to be moving much more in the direction of political solutions and actually getting the arms out of these regions. One thing that would be useful would be to tell the Saudis and the Qataris not to be funding the kind of groups that ISIS and similar types of groups. We want to get the weapons out of the situation, demilitarize it, and do everything we can to reduce tension.
Can I just have a quick question for Chris? Chris, do you think that Russia invaded Russia invaded Ukraine?
Ukraine?
Yeah.
You mean Crimea?
And as well as eastern Ukraine.
Well, you gave the figure of 10,000 troops.
No. That wasn't my question.
But I'm saying you gave the figure of 10,000 troops, and I haven't seen that figure in anywhere else.
That wasn't my question.
No, I know, but I'm coming to answer your question. I think there are Russian soldiers, and I think there is Russian hardware in eastern Ukraine. I think exactly how official that is, whether that's being driven by the government, I'm not absolutely sure. And honestly,
so Russia did not annex Crimea?
No, I'm getting on to that point. If you'll let me.
It was a quick question.
Yeah, but you talked about eastern Ukraine, not Crimea.
So Russia has.
So can I finish? So what I'm saying is, I think there are Russian troops. I think there are Russian tanks in eastern Ukraine at the moment. It may well be on a kind of slightly unofficial basis. Definitely, it's nowhere near 10,000 troops. I mean, we know that. And the crisis in eastern Ukraine happened before. Undoubtedly kicked off before there was any Russian militarization of the situation. They did clearly take.
So do you condemn Russian militarization of the situation?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a good thing. No, I don't.
But do you condemn what Russia? Do you condemn Russia's annexation of Crimea?
I think I think it was unhelpful. But I think it's a situation that has been detonated primarily and created and generated in the first place by what I talk about, which you haven't mentioned, which is the incredible expansion of Western military power into the region, which was almost inevitably going to create a reaction. And I actually think it's incredible. It's surprising that it hasn't created more of a reaction now. And if you could stop interrupting me. So, yeah, I'm against escalation. That's what I just said. But we're in the West. And what we need to do, because we're in the West, we need to talk about what the West should and shouldn't do primarily. And for me,
why not?
Because
why not condemn what Russia is doing?
I just did.
We're running out of time.
Okay,
we've discussed this at length, I think.
In terms of where we're going to go next, I would just like to say there are some important conversations taking place in Minsk today. I think the peace plan that President Putin outlined can be the basis of some move forward with a couple of additions. I think all Russian, not just Ukrainian heavy artillery and so on, has to be moved out of eastern Ukraine, but all of the Russian military and all of its hardware, the armoured columns and all the rest, all needs to be gone. That needs to be internationally monitored, all of it, the Ukrainian and Russian side, and the border has to be put under international control, I think, by OSCE observers and others to make sure that that is secure. And then I think you might have the basis for at least a space, a pause in which people inside Ukraine can have a political conversation about what kind of long-term settlement there might be. And I think on the point of exercises, finally, I don't think all of these exercises are welcome or useful. I think personally myself that applies to some of the exercises that involve NATO countries, although they're in a very small scale involving about 1,500 troops in the far west of Ukraine. And of course, I will just end on this point, and I know some won't like it, but they don't compare in anything like the scale of the genuinely quite massive, tens of thousands of troops, scale of Russian military exercises which have been taking place close to Ukraine and elsewhere. And a number of different exercises. And everybody knows
they're on Russian
territory. Everybody knows that they're there to politically intimidate people in Eastern Europe.
Russia.
It's not rocket
so you're okay with Russian aggression on the border, but you're not okay. You're against.
Please, we're going round the table. Sonny, I heard you saying that next NATO should be putting troops in Ukraine. Wouldn't it be pouring oil on fire?
But
I agree. I mean, I don't think that NATO. I think NATO troops in Ukraine would escalate the situation.
Well, that's what's happening.
Yeah, right. But the Ukrainian sovereignty cannot be guaranteed unless Russian troops come back from the border and Russian troops come out of Eastern Europe. So Russia, unless it takes the first steps, does not de-escalate the situation. And unless Russia does that, we are not going to reach anywhere near a peace deal. So NATO has two choices. Either it completely says, abandons Ukraine and says, you know what, we can't guarantee you.
Ukraine's not in NATO.
So can you just let me finish the point? Either NATO says to Ukraine that, sorry, we kind of led you up the garden path and said to you earlier that we will support you, but now we're not going to do that. And in which case, other countries in Eastern Europe, which are part of NATO, will sort of doubt whether NATO is a viable alliance, and they will start worrying about their own security. Or NATO says to Ukraine, we will help you because our own members are also being threatened here. So NATO has to do the latter, in my view, and the latter means that it has to tell Russia quite in strong terms that you either de-escalate and you leave, or we will put troops in the region. So I think that unless Russia makes the first steps to de-escalate, then Russia has no business telling other people that they're escalating, because its troops are the reason why there is so much tension.
Okay, Sonia, we heard you. Dmitry, What is the best way of guaranteeing Ukraine's security and de-escalating this crisis and actually going into the peaceful solutions?
I liked the constructive tone of Ian Kearns, and I would like to continue in that vein. I think urgent talks need to take place between Russia and NATO. Maybe we should re-establish the framework of Russia-NATO Council talks on preserving the arms and security agreements which we had and which are all seem to be threatened right now. We should decide what we do with NATO-Russia Founding Act signed in 1997. Probably both sides should take certain obligations upon themselves. I would remind you that the idea of that pact, of that Founding Act, was very good. You know, NATO proclaimed that it had no intention to station its troops permanently very close to Russian borders, and Russia took certain obligations upon itself, which could be useful right now. Also, I think that talks in Minsk need to be held, but Kiev should be represented by someone else than former President Leonid Kuchma, who is extremely unpopular both in the west and in the east of Ukraine. Kiev should be represented by someone serious. Of course, representatives of eastern Ukraine should also be invited. In general, we should draw lessons from the past crisis. I would remind you that former President Yanukovych suggested a trilateral meeting between Russia, EU and Ukraine on ironing out their difference over that association agreement that he failed to sign in November last year. Let me remind you that the whole crisis grew out of a minor issue, the timing of Ukraine signing this association agreement with the EU. Yanukovych did not cancel it, he just postponed its signing. So we should not allow this to happen again. I would remind you that at the time the trilateral meeting was basically rejected by Brussels, by Barroso and Ashton. I think they were the worst European Commission in its history, and such mistakes should not be repeated in future. In future, the main solution is any kind of talk is better than confrontation. Any kind of contact is better than the so-called colored revolutions or minor military actions. The crisis in Ukraine should become a lesson. It should be avoided in the future. And Russia and NATO need to return to some tried frameworks of cooperation, such as the Russia-NATO Council. We may return to the good old diplomacy when both sides probably did not trust each other, but they respected their obligations. The formula of George Bush the Jr., we don't need written agreements because the Cold War is over, we trust each other. This logic no longer works. We should return to dialogue, but on very, very precise formulas.
Thank you, Dmitry, and I'm afraid this ends our discussion about the NATO-Wales summit and its relations with Russia, especially over the Ukraine crisis. I am Nikolai Goshkov, and with me in the studio Voice of Russia in London were Sunny Handel, Dr. Ian Kearns, Chris Ninan, and on the line from Moscow, Dmitry Pavlichin.
Leaders have done. I personally was very critical of the intervention in Iraq. Although one can be very critical of that, it's a gross overstatement to say that what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Iraq are just a product of NATO policy. I mean, there are lots of other actors here which have to take a substantial portion of the responsibility, and right now, I think inside Ukraine, President Putin has to take a lot of responsibility for what's going on. I think many analysts in Russia and President Putin and his advisors themselves have made a mistake with Ukraine. They feared that Ukraine would become part of NATO. And I think the reason why this is a mistake is that there is just no consensus inside NATO to offer membership to Ukraine or to Georgia for that matter. I've noted people already commenting today that Rasmussen's talked about some support for Georgia. The key decision that was taken by NATO in terms of enlargement this year was 2 months ago. And it basically made clear to the Georgians and to everybody else that nobody else was getting in from the Caucasus, Ukraine, or anybody else. And there's absolutely no chance of Ukraine being offered NATO membership or Georgia being offered NATO membership for the next decade at least, and probably 2 decades.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, let's actually go to a Russian analyst here. Is not Russian reaction an overreaction, really?
Well, first I would like to disagree what Ian Kearns just said. With all due respect, I didn't conclude from the statements from Mr. Rasmussen that NATO membership is not
Hello and welcome to Voice of Russia debate. I am Nikolai Goshkov and I will be discussing the outcome of the NATO summit in Wales. Its blueprint for tomorrow, as its outgoing Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said at the news conference. Well, it was originally expected to be a dull, mundane affair of discussing lessons learned from Afghanistan and some brainstorming maybe in the search for new raison d'etre after what looked like the end of an era of military incursions into Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. The almost moribund NATO, in the words of quite a few commentators, was facing yet another challenge of reinventing itself. Not anymore, though. One might suggest that if there was no Ukraine crisis, it should have been invented. Or was it? Some tough words were spoken at the summit and some tough action is pending. So where to now for NATO, Russia and Ukraine? To discuss this, I am joined in the Voice of Russia London studio by Sunny Handel, journalist, political commentator, editor of the political blog Liberal Conspiracy, Dr. Ian Kearns, co-founder and director of the European Leadership Network, Chris Nynam, co-founder and vice chair of Stop the War Coalition, and on the line from Moscow, a political analyst with Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich. Welcome to the debate, gentlemen. The NATO summit's agenda and its running order were changed several times over in reaction to events on the ground, mostly in Ukraine and Iraq. Is NATO trying to firefight here rather than painstakingly work to create an all-inclusive system of collective security from the Atlantic to the Pacific, as Russia has been suggesting for a long time? Chris Snyder.
Well, I think in a certain sense both. I think the crises that we're seeing in Iraq and in Ukraine are the product of decades of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. We've seen, I think, 12 new Eastern European countries accede to NATO since 1991. And I think that's the background to the situation in Ukraine. Clearly, the background to what's happened in Iraq is the occupation, primarily, fundamentally, the invasion and occupation of 2003 onwards. So the more aggressive foreign policies that have been pursued by NATO and its leading member countries particularly have created the crises. But now you very much have the feeling that the leadership doesn't know how to deal with them. It doesn't have any solutions apart from almost reluctantly more of the same. We're talking about growing pressure to escalate the bombing in Iraq and increased sanctions against Russia, but a kind of gradual drawing in of more forces into the theatre in Eastern Europe. So you kind of feel they don't really know how to respond to the mayhem that their policies over the last 2 or 3 decades have caused.
Well, we heard, of course, a lot during the summit and before it that, thank goodness, NATO has expanded before the current crisis, because at least now a lot of countries feel more safe than they otherwise would have been had NATO not expanded. But this is, especially in the face of Russia's perceived belligerence, isn't this really a question of chicken and egg? Whether NATO expansion is a result of Russia's perceived belligerence, or is Russia's perceived belligerence a result of a relentless NATO expansion? Dr. Kearns.
Well, I think that's a good question because there were many analysts in the West, including very influential ones like George Kennan, who opposed the enlargement of NATO into Eastern Europe. And that wing of the debate wasn't able to win the argument, and NATO enlarged. You're right that if you go to many capitals in Eastern Europe, that their strong perception there is that they wanted to be inside NATO because they feared Russia. They feared what kind of actor Russia would become when the Soviet Union broke up. And they now, many of them, view what's happened as a justification of their original fears and are very pleased that they're inside NATO because they think it provides them with some kind of protection. And I think although one can be very critical of many things that Western...
In view for Ukraine for such a long period, he basically just recently visited Kiev and he said that if Ukraine gives up the legislation which makes it a non-bloc country, according to a certain Ukrainian law, Ukraine cannot be a member of a military bloc. So if Ukraine lifts that legislation, it can join NATO. And now that Ukraine, I will be calling a spade, now that Ukraine is no longer a democracy, that there is just one group of parties and one ideology ruling the country, unopposed, unlike it was during the last 23 years, it will be very easy to lift this law because now the south and the east of the country are not represented in the new parliament. They will not be represented starting from October, and right now the parliament is completely, under the influence of the prime minister, the president, and the group that holds power. So it will be very easy to join NATO under such circumstances. For Georgia, it's the same situation. Mr. Rasmussen at the NATO summit has just said that they are preparing a package of documents. Today I watched an interview on BBC with Georgi Margvelashvili, the Georgian president. He said that his country was going to join NATO. It was in the works. And I perceive what's going on very tragically. I think what we see now is the whole security system